What would you do if someone looked at you and decided, in an instant, that you didn't belong? No words exchanged, no questions asked, just an assumption written on their face. Now imagine that happening not on the street, but in the comfort of a first-class cabin where dignity should be guaranteed. That's exactly what Jordan and Leah Miles experienced. They boarded their flight with quiet confidence, yet instead of being welcomed, they were doubted, questioned, and subtly pushed aside. A flight attendant's remarks weren't loud, but they cut deep, suggesting, without ever saying it outright, "You don't deserve this seat." At that moment, they faced a choice: ignore the insult and endure the silence, or rise above it and reveal a truth that would leave everyone speechless. In just 3 minutes, their decision would not only change the atmosphere in that cabin, it would challenge an entire system. If it had been you, sitting in that seat, how would you have responded? Would you shrink back or stand up? Join us now for a story of dignity, courage, and revelation. And don't forget like, share, and subscribe so you'll never miss the stories that truly matter. She thought they didn't belong in first class. 3 minutes later, the entire cabin would fall into silence. The morning sky over San Francisco glowed pale gold, the kind of light that hints at a long day of departures and reunions. At San Francisco International Airport, travelers moved in tides of urgency, families tugging children toward security, business people with eyes fixed on their phones, vacationers juggling suitcases and iced coffees. Amid the noise and fluorescent light, there was one corner of calm, the first-class check-in counter. Behind the polished counter stood a young attendant, her blazer crisply pressed, her smile practiced. She was trained to project warmth, but when Jordan Miles and Leah Miles stepped forward, that smile faltered. Only slightly, so slight that someone rushing by would never have noticed. But Jordan noticed. Leah noticed. They always did. Jordan handed over the boarding passes with a calm hand. His suit jacket was simple navy, no flashy watch, no loud accessories. Leah wore a cream blouse tucked neatly into dark slacks, her curly hair swept back, gold studs glinting at her ears. They looked, to the casual eye, like any other couple traveling together. But to the attendant, they looked different. "Good morning," she said, her tone a shade too stiff. Her eyes dropped to the tickets. "First class, Aurora Air, Flight 221 to Washington, D.C." A faint flicker passed across her face. Curiosity, maybe doubt. She handed the tickets back quickly, her voice bright again. "Enjoy your flight." Jordan gave a polite nod. Leah's lips curved into a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As they walked away, she whispered, "You caught that, didn't you?" Jordan's reply was low, steady, every time, but let's not let it set the tone. They moved toward the security line, side by side, their pace unhurried. For anyone watching, they appeared simply composed, the kind of couple accustomed to airports, accustomed to travel. Few could have guessed that beneath the calm surface lay years of silent battles, stares, whispered comments, the constant question of whether they belonged. The Aurora Air first-class lounge was designed for escape. Soft leather chairs lined the wide windows overlooking the runways. A muted jazz playlist floated through the air. Baristas poured cappuccinos with practiced elegance, while businessmen hunched over laptops. Every detail whispered exclusivity, privacy, importance. When Jordan and Leah entered, conversations dipped for a moment, just slightly. A pair of older travelers near the window lifted their eyes from a newspaper, tracking the couple's movements with the subtle curiosity of people who wondered, "Who are they?" Leah felt it. She always felt it. Not outright hostility, just that lingering question in people's eyes. Do they belong here? She slid her arm through Jordan's and whispered, half teasing, half weary, you'd think after all these years, first class wouldn't feel like a spotlight. Jordan squeezed her hand gently. Let them wonder. They found seats in a quiet corner. A server approached almost immediately, his tone warm, professional. Can I get you anything to drink? Coffee? Tea? Maybe champagne coffee for me, Leah said. Make that 2, Jordan added. As the server moved away, Leah pulled out her tablet. On the screen was a set of notes highlighted in yellow. She scrolled slowly, her brow furrowed. Jordan leaned back, watching her, then asked softly, numbers still telling the same story. Yes, she murmured. Customer satisfaction in premium cabins is lower for minority travelers. Not drastically, but enough to notice. Enough to hurt. Jordan's jaw tightened, just barely. Then we're in the right place. This wasn't leisure. For Jordan and Leah, this trip had a purpose. As CEO and CFO of Aurora Air, they had decided to see the customer experience for themselves, not in suits behind a boardroom table, but in the quiet anonymity of travelers. They wanted to know what was real. Around them, the lounge returned to its hum. A man nearby shuffled his newspaper, but stole a glance in their direction. A woman adjusted her scarf, her eyes following the couple with the kind of curiosity she wouldn't have had for anyone else. Leah sipped her coffee, lowered her voice. You ever get tired of being the question mark in the room? Jordan gave a small smile, though his eyes stayed serious. No, because every time, it reminds me why we fight to change it. Boarding was announced earlier than expected. Jordan and Leah gathered their things, moving toward the gate. The same attendant from check-in glanced at them again, her polite smile taut, almost apologetic. Jordan held her gaze for a moment, then walked on. The jet bridge smelled faintly of fuel and recirculated air. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin gleamed polished wood paneling, wide leather seats, mood lighting set low. Passengers stowed bags, adjusted seats, tapped screens. It was a space designed to whisper comfort, exclusivity, belonging. That was when they first saw Diana Collins, the lead flight attendant, tall, composed, hair pulled back into a sleek bun, her uniform immaculate. Her eyes caught the couple as they stepped into the cabin. The smile she offered was professional, but her gaze lingered a fraction too long. Good morning, Diana said. Welcome aboard. Her tone was even, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a question unspoken. Jordan and Leah slid into seats 2A and 2B. Their movements were practiced, calm, as if this were routine. But beneath the composure, Leah felt the subtle edge in Diana's voice, the weight of being observed. She glanced at Jordan. He was already leaning back, eyes forward, but his fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, his only tell. Leah leaned closer, murmuring, "So it begins." Jordan gave the faintest smile, eyes still fixed ahead. "Then let's see how far it goes." The engines hummed. Passengers settled. Diana moved briskly down the aisle, her posture sharp, her smile tight. She had served thousands of travelers over the years, but something about Jordan and Leah unsettled her. She couldn't have explained it, not even to herself. All she knew was that, in her mind, they didn't quite fit the picture of first-class passengers, and that was the thought that would set everything else in motion. For Jordan and Leah Miles, airports were never just gateways. They were mirrors, reflecting a world that still measured people before knowing them. As they settled into their seats on Aurora Air Flight 221, the hum of boarding all around, The couple carried more than just luggage. They carried a mission. Jordan leaned back, adjusting his seat, but his thoughts were far from comfort. He remembered the first time he had ever boarded a plane as a child. He was 9, clutching his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. The year was 1989, and his family was traveling from Atlanta to Chicago for a cousin's wedding. In the waiting area, a man in a gray suit had looked down at them and muttered under his breath, "They must be lost." His mother had straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and said quietly to Jordan, "Never let them tell you where you belong. You decide that." Those words had never left him. Now, decades later, Jordan was the CEO of one of the nation's fastest-rising airlines, Aurora Air, yet sitting in seat 2A, watching Diana Collins stride past with her clipboard, he felt the same knot forming in his chest that he had felt as a boy. The stares, the whispers, the questions. Did he belong? Leah noticed it too, as she always did. She had known Jordan since college, back when he was the quiet one who always sat in the front row, scribbling furiously in notebooks. She had admired his discipline then, and she admired it now, though she also knew the cost of that discipline. It meant swallowing slights, holding back frustration, carrying the weight of dignity, even when dignity was the last thing the world wanted to offer. She reached over, resting her hand gently on his arm. "You're tapping again," she whispered. Jordan glanced down, stilled his fingers, and gave a small smile. "I didn't even notice. You always do it when you're holding something in." His smile faded. "Maybe I am." Leah looked around the cabin. Other passengers were arranging pillows, plugging in headphones, scrolling on phones, but a few eyes lingered on them longer than necessary. A man across the aisle adjusted his glasses, pretending to study the safety card, though his gaze kept sliding toward them. A woman 2 rows ahead leaned in close to her husband, whispering words Leah couldn't hear, but could guess. Leah took a quiet breath. Same script, different day. Jordan's eyes stayed forward. "That's why we're here." It wasn't just a business trip. Jordan and Leah had chosen this flight deliberately. In recent months, Aurora Air had been flooded with complaints not of delayed flights or lost baggage, but of subtle, painful experiences of bias. Minority travelers describing feeling unwelcome in premium cabins. Families of color being second-guessed, questioned, even moved to lower classes of service. The board had raised concerns. Investors whispered about lawsuits. But for Jordan and Leah, it wasn't just about numbers or liability. It was personal. Aurora Air had been their dream, built from long nights, relentless pitches, and an unshakable belief that the sky should be open to everyone. To hear that bias had seeped into their airline was like hearing that a child they had raised was hurting people without realizing it, so they had decided to see for themselves. No VIP announcement, no entourage, just 2 tickets, 2 seats, 2 watchful sets of eyes and ears. As the flight attendants prepared the cabin, Leah opened her tablet again. She scrolled past charts and survey results, stopping at a highlighted paragraph. "Listen to this," she murmured. "Passenger report from 2 weeks ago. I was told by a flight attendant that I must have taken the wrong seat. She didn't believe my boarding pass until another attendant stepped in. I felt humiliated the entire flight." Jordan closed his eyes briefly, the words cutting deep. "Sounds familiar." Leah tilted her head toward Diana, who was leaning against the galley door, speaking quietly to another crew member. Jordan followed her gaze. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the faint smirk, the dismissive wave of a hand. He knew that look. He had seen it in boardrooms, at country clubs, even at parent-teacher conferences when their daughter Maya was in elementary school. It was the look that said, "You don't fit my picture of belonging." Jordan shifted in his seat, steadying himself. "She's already decided we don't belong here." Leah's voice was low but calm. "Then she's about to learn something she won't forget." The intercom crackled, breaking the moment. Diana's voice filled the cabin, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Aurora Air Flight 221 nonstop service to Washington. D.C. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened, tray tables secured, and all electronic devices switched to airplane mode." Her tone carried the authority of someone used to command, but underneath, Jordan thought he caught a trace of something else. Not nerves, something harder. Skepticism. As the engines roared to life, Leah leaned back, eyes closed, but her thoughts churned. She remembered her own first brush with bias in the air. She had been 22 flying home from New York after a summer internship. She had saved up for a first-class upgrade, excited to feel, for once, what it meant to be on the other side of the curtain. But when she reached her seat, the flight attendant had stopped her, blocking the aisle. "Miss, economy is that way." The humiliation had burned hot in her chest. She had shown her ticket, her voice shaking, and watched the attendant's forced smile return. She had vowed, then and there, that if she ever had the power, she would make sure no one else felt that way again. Now, sitting beside Jordan, she felt the weight of that vow. Aurora Air wasn't just a company. It was the chance to build a different future. But first, they had to face the reality that even their own airline wasn't immune. The plane lifted, breaking free of the runway, climbing into the morning sky. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers stirred, stretching, unbuckling. Diana appeared again, her steps measured, her eyes sweeping the cabin. She paused near Jordan and Leah's row, her smile polite, her voice clipped. "Is everything all right here?" Jordan met her gaze evenly. "Yes, everything's fine. Good," she replied, but lingered a moment longer, her eyes flicking over their seats, their bags, their posture, as though searching for evidence of a mistake. Then she moved on. Leah exhaled softly. "She's testing us." Jordan's lips curved into a small, unreadable smile. "Then let's see how far she's willing to go." In the rows around them, a quiet current of awareness rippled. Some passengers pretended not to notice. Others stole quick glances. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. It was as though the cabin itself sensed that something more than a flight to Washington was underway. Something larger was about to unfold, and Jordan and Leah, calm and composed on the surface, knew it too. The cabin lights glowed in a soft amber, bouncing gently off polished mahogany trim. Every detail in Aurora Air's first-class cabin was designed to whisper exclusivity, the wide seats stitched in cream leather, the gentle jazz humming low in the background, the subtle scent of citrus from freshly cleaned air vents. Most passengers slid into this curated comfort as though it were second nature. For Jordan and Leah Miles, however, the glow carried a different weight. They had entered this arena with eyes wide open, knowing it was here, in the quiet rituals of service and subtle glances, that invisible battles were fought. Diana Collins, the lead flight attendant, moved briskly along the aisle. Her heels clicked softly against the carpet, her clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. She had built her career on precision, on an unspoken belief that first class was a standard that must be protected. That belief, however, was tangled with biases she rarely examined. She believed she could read passengers at a glance, tell who belonged, who did not, who had earned their seat, and who had merely found their way here by accident. Her gaze kept circling back to Jordan and Leah. They weren't loud, weren't ostentatious. Their luggage was modest, their clothes professional but not flashy. It was their quietness, their composure, that unsettled her. To Diana, first-class passengers announced themselves with brand-name suits, diamond jewelry, the casual arrogance of entitlement. Jordan and Leah carried none of that. To her, they seemed like people passing through, not people rooted in this space. She leaned toward a younger attendant, whispering just low enough that only the closest ear could catch. They don't exactly scream first class, do they? The younger attendant, barely a year into the job, glanced at Diana with unease. They're passengers, just like anyone else. Maybe, Diana replied, straightening her clipboard, but I've seen plenty of people wander up here by mistake. It pays to be vigilant. Jordan, though appearing relaxed in his seat, caught the edge in her voice. Years of boardrooms had trained his ears to recognize when suspicion was dressed as professionalism. He let the words settle, not yet responding. Leah, tablet still in her lap, felt the tension in his posture, the faint tapping of his finger against the armrest starting again. She reached out, covering his hand with hers, a silent reminder to hold steady. The hum of conversation in the cabin thinned. A man across the aisle, with silver hair and a crisp navy blazer, kept stealing glances over the top of his newspaper. A younger woman 2 rows ahead tilted her head slightly, whispering into her partner's ear. The air thickened with curiosity. These weren't strangers simply observing. They were witnesses waiting for a story to unfold. Leah leaned closer to Jordan. "She's watching us." He gave a faint smirk. "Let her. We're not here to make her comfortable." Their server arrived with a tray of drinks, his smile genuine and unforced. "Would you care for champagne, orange juice, or sparkling water?" he asked warmly. "Water's fine," Leah said with a polite smile. "Same for me," Jordan added. The server nodded, placing 2 glasses before them, before moving to the next row. As he walked away, Diana's shadow fell over their seats. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. Her tone dipped in courtesy that felt like sugar poured over steel. Jordan met her gaze evenly. "Yes, everything's fine." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the untouched glasses. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." The words were polite, but her smile was thin, her eyes carrying a challenge. Leah's voice was low, steady. "She's trying to figure us out." Jordan didn't blink. "She doesn't need to. She already has." As Diana walked away, her shoulders stiff, Leah exhaled quietly. She could feel the unspoken ripple passing through the cabin, passengers leaning into their own judgments. This was how bias worked, not always through shouting or insults, but through the quiet drip of assumption, the sense of being on trial without ever stepping into a courtroom. "In the galley." Diana bristled. She set her clipboard down with a sharper thud than she intended. One of her colleagues, Mark, a flight attendant with a decade of service, raised an eyebrow. "You all right? I'm fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. Mark folded his arms. "They're just passengers. Diana, let it go." "They don't fit," she muttered under her breath. "Fit what he asked." She didn't answer. She couldn't articulate it without hearing the wrongness of her own thoughts. Instead, she lifted the clipboard again and busied herself with notes. though her pen pressed harder than necessary against the paper. Back in their seats, Leah scrolled through survey comments again, though her focus was elsewhere. She remembered times when she had been the only black woman in a room full of executives. Her every word weighed heavier, judged harsher, simply because it came from her mouth. She remembered once leaving a meeting in tears, not from what was said, but from what was never said, the silent message that she didn't belong. She thought about those moments now, wondering how many other passengers carried the same invisible scars, the same exhaustion of proving and reproving themselves. Jordan's voice pulled her back. "She's not going to stop." Leah looked at him. "Steady. Then neither are we." The seatbelt sign blinked on again as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. A few passengers clutched armrests, conversations pausing until the plane smoothed once more. In the brief silence, Jordan's thoughts drifted to their daughter, Maya, 14 years old, bright, determined, already asking questions about why the world seemed tilted in ways that never made sense. He had promised her that Aurora Air was different, that they were building something where she would never feel out of place. Sitting here now, watching Diana's watchful eyes from across the cabin, he wondered if that promise was strong enough. Leah must have read the doubt on his face. She reached for his hand again, her grip firm. "This isn't just about us," she whispered. "This is about every Maya, every kid who deserves better. Remember that." Jordan nodded, grounding himself in her words. Diana reappeared, clipboard in hand, her expression composed, but her steps sharper, as though she had rehearsed her next move. She stopped at their row, her voice just loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "There seems to be some confusion," she said. Leah lifted her eyes calmly. "Confusion?" "Yes," Diana replied, flipping through her clipboard pages. "I don't see your names listed for these seats." "Are you sure you're in the right section?" The words landed like stones in the still cabin. Conversations faltered, eyes turned. The silver-haired man lowered his newspaper completely now, openly watching. The younger woman 2 rows ahead leaned closer to hear. The atmosphere shifted from quiet curiosity to anticipation. A confrontation was underway. Jordan finally turned, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Our boarding passes say 2A and 2B. Perhaps you should check again." Diana's lips thinned. She flipped through her papers in a show of diligence, though her frown betrayed her frustration. "It's possible there was a mistake at the gate. Mix-ups happen." Leah tilted her head slightly. "So you're suggesting the mistake is ours?" Diana hesitated, her veneer of professionalism slipping. "I'm suggesting it's unusual to see passengers unfamiliar with first-class protocols." The air in the cabin grew heavier, charged. A man across the aisle cleared his throat, then thought better of speaking. A woman ahead gripped her armrest tighter. Leah felt the sting behind the words, the sting of being told, once again, without it being said outright, "You don't belong." Jordan's voice cut through the silence. "Unusual to you doesn't mean wrong." Diana opened her mouth to respond, but for the first time, her confidence faltered under his steady gaze. Around them, the cabin held its breath. The flight to Washington had only just begun, but already, it was clear this was not going to be an ordinary journey. The engines had steadied into a low, constant hum, the kind of sound that lulled some passengers into drowsy comfort. But for Jordan and Leah Miles, there was no comfort in this moment. They sat upright, composed, but every sense was alert. They knew the script of these encounters too well, How a glance could turn into a question. How a question could turn into suspicion. How suspicion could unravel into humiliation. What they did not know was how far Diana Collins, the lead flight attendant, was prepared to take it. Diana stood near the galley door, clipboard in hand, her eyes flicking repeatedly to row 2. She told herself she was simply doing her job, ensuring order, but underneath the surface churned something deeper. She had worked for Aurora Air for nearly 15 years, rising from junior attendant to lead. She prided herself on discipline, on setting standards, on knowing at a glance who fit the image of first class. Jordan and Leah disrupted that image. They unsettled her certainty. The longer she looked at them, the more convinced she became that something was wrong. She leaned toward her colleague Mark again, her voice sharp. "I'm telling you, they're not supposed to be there." Mark shook his head, his voice low and firm. "Their tickets checked out. Let it go. Diana, you're making this about you." Her jaw tightened. "I know what I see, and sometimes what you see is just your bias," Mark countered, before turning back to his task. Diana's grip tightened on the clipboard. Bias. The word gnawed at her, stoking irritation. She wasn't biased, she told herself. She was vigilant. She was protecting the integrity of her cabin, in their seats. Jordan adjusted his posture, exhaling slowly. Leah, eyes still fixed on her tablet, spoke softly without looking up. "She's circling again." "I know," Jordan murmured. His voice was even, but Leah recognized the quiet edge beneath it. Years of holding his composure had taught him to sound calm when he was anything but. The silver-haired man across the aisle rustled his newspaper again, stealing another glance. His eyes lingered, filled with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The couple 2 rows ahead whispered more openly now, their heads leaning close together. The cabin was becoming an audience. Diana stepped forward at last, her heels deliberate on the carpet, her presence commanding more attention than the safety demonstration had minutes earlier. She stopped at row 2, clipboard poised like evidence. "Mr. and Mrs. Miles," she began. Her tone clipped. "I'll need to see your boarding passes again." Jordan raised his eyes, steady and unflinching. "We already showed them." "Yes, but I've been reviewing the manifest," she said, flipping through the pages as though searching for proof. "And I don't see your names listed for these seats." Leah set her tablet down slowly, her movements precise. "Are you suggesting there's been some mistake?" "It happens," Diana replied quickly. "Seats get reassigned. Sometimes passengers misunderstand their boarding group. It's unusual, but not impossible." Jordan leaned forward slightly, his tone low but carrying. "Unusual doesn't mean impossible, and it certainly doesn't mean wrong." The words hung in the air. Conversations in nearby rows quieted. A woman clutched her pearls, staring openly now. A young man 3 rows back pulled out his phone, angling it discreetly as though capturing the moment. The cabin had shifted fully into silence, the kind of silence that waits for escalation. Leah tilted her head, her expression calm but sharp. "Tell me, Ms. Collins, what exactly about us seems unusual for a split second?" Diana faltered. She hadn't expected the question to be so direct. Her lips parted, but no words came. She quickly glanced at her clipboard again. Stalling. "I'm only saying that most of our regular first-class passengers are well more familiar with the protocols." The silver-haired man frowned, lowering his newspaper completely. He wasn't sure yet what to say, but the tension in his jaw suggested he was no longer just a bystander. Jordan's voice cut through the heavy air. Protocols don't define belonging. Tickets do. And our tickets say we belong here. Diana's eyes narrowed, though her voice stayed sugar-coated. Then you won't mind showing them again. Just to clear up the confusion. Without breaking eye contact. Jordan reached calmly for the tickets on the tray table. He handed them over with deliberate precision. Diana studied them closely, her frown deepening as she found no flaw, no error, no reason to justify her suspicion. Finally, she returned them, her smile tight. These appear valid, she admitted, but I still find the situation irregular. Leah's voice was quiet, but each word landed with weight. Irregular to you, not to us, not to the system that assigned these seats. Perhaps it's time to ask yourself why it feels irregular at all. Gas whispered through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others sat straighter, intrigued. For the first time, Diana felt her confidence waver. The calm precision of the couple unsettled her more than anger would have. Anger she could dismiss, but dignity that was harder to fight. Emily, the youngest attendant on the crew, stepped forward now, her voice tentative but firm. Is everything all right here? Diana stiffened. Everything's fine. I'm just clarifying a seating issue. Emily's gaze flicked apologetically toward Jordan and Leah. I'm sorry for any inconvenience, she said softly. Jordan inclined his head in acknowledgement. We're fine. Thank you. Emily lingered a moment, her eyes saying more than her words. I see what's happening. I don't agree with it. Then she stepped back. Diana felt heat rise in her cheeks. She lowered her voice, leaning closer to Jordan and Leah, though still loud enough that nearby passengers could catch her words. I don't know how you manage this, but it won't last. People notice when something doesn't belong. Jordan's gaze sharpened, his voice steady but laced with quiet power. I suggest you think very carefully about what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Diana said quickly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Then it's time to stop this conversation before it goes further than you can handle, Jordan replied. The silence that followed was electric. Passengers glanced at one another, their expressions a mixture of shock, discomfort, and anticipation. Diana straightened her uniform, her composure cracking, and stepped back stiffly. I'll be back to check on you later, she said before retreating toward the galley. Leah released a slow breath, unclenching her grip on the armrest. That could have gone worse. It's not over, Jordan murmured. His eyes were steady, his jaw set. But it will be soon. In the galley. Diana pressed her hands to the counter, her heart racing faster than she wanted to admit. She replayed the exchange in her mind, anger mingling with unease. She told herself she was right, that she was defending standards, but the words of Mark and Emily echoed bias. Let it go. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced through her certainty. In their seats. Jordan and Leah sat side by side, quiet on the surface but storming within. Jordan thought of Maya again, of the promise he carried to her. Leah thought of the passengers watching, some silently rooting for them, others silently against. They both knew this wasn't just about their dignity. It was about what this moment represented for everyone who had ever been told, in words or in silence, you don't belong. And the flight to Washington had only just begun. The hum of the engines filled the silence that Diana Collins had left behind, a silence that seemed to spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Passengers who had once been buried in magazines or half asleep in reclining seats now sat a little straighter, attuned to the tension that clung to row 2. Every whisper carried further than intended. Every sideways glance felt weighted. Jordan Miles adjusted his seatbelt, a deliberate act of calm. On the surface he was unshaken, his expression composed, his posture measured, but inside he could feel his pulse racing. Not from fear, he was long past being afraid of moments like these, but from the familiar anger of being judged before being known. He had carried that anger through boardrooms, through airports, through polished hotels where he was mistaken for staff instead of a guest. He had learned to master it, to channel it, but it never fully left. Leah Miles watched him closely. She had seen this look before, the storm held beneath the surface. She reached for his hand again, grounding him with her touch. "Stay with me," she whispered. His fingers tightened around hers, the smallest nod confirming he heard her. "I'm here, across the aisle." The silver-haired man cleared his throat. For the first time, he spoke. She was out of line. Jordan turned his head, surprised. The man's eyes were steady, his voice low enough not to echo, but strong enough to carry. "I've flown this airline for years," the man continued. "I've never seen anyone asked to show their ticket twice. Not unless—" He stopped himself, catching the weight of his own words. "Not unless there was an assumption." Leah offered a faint smile, though her voice was gentle. "We're used to assumptions." The man hesitated, then nodded slowly, folding his newspaper and setting it aside. He did not say more, but his silence now felt different, less complicit, more allied. 2 rows ahead, the younger woman who had whispered to her partner earlier leaned back just enough to catch Leah's eye. Her expression was conflicted, uneasy, but she gave the slightest nod. It was subtle, but Leah read it for what it was, an acknowledgement. People were beginning to see. In the galley, Diana busied herself with tasks she didn't need to do, rearranging napkins, checking stock, writing meaningless notes on her clipboard. She could feel the cabin's judgment pressing against her back. Her confidence wavered, yet her pride refused to let go. She convinced herself she was right, that her vigilance was necessary. But the echo of Leah's words gnawed at her. Perhaps it's time to ask yourself why it feels irregular at all. Emily, the youngest attendant, stepped into the galley quietly. "Diana," she said softly, "maybe let it rest." "I'm just doing my job," Diana replied, too quickly. Emily shook her head. "No, you're doing something else, and everyone can see it." Diana's jaw clenched, her grip on the clipboard tightening. She wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she turned away, her reflection staring back at her in the metal cabinet, shoulders squared, eyes narrowed. A picture of control that looked more like stubbornness. Back in their seats, Jordan opened his phone discreetly, scrolling through notes and emails, though his mind wasn't on the screen. He was remembering board meetings where investors questioned his leadership more harshly than others. He was remembering a conference where a hotel clerk assumed he was the driver waiting for the keynote speaker, when in fact, he was the keynote speaker. These weren't memories he wanted to summon, but Diana's words had pulled them forward like ghosts he thought he'd left behind. Leah saw the shift in his eyes. "You're replaying old tapes again, aren't you?" He nodded faintly. "Hard not to." "Then let's record a new one," she said firmly. "Right here, right now." Her resolve steadied him. That was Leah's gift where he carried storms. She carried anchors. Together, they had always balanced. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants began preparing for meal service. Mark, the senior attendant, approached Jordan and Leah's row with a professional smile that carried a trace of apology. "Would you like to see the menu?" he asked. Jordan accepted it, his voice calm. "Thank you." Mark hesitated, lowering his voice. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About earlier. It shouldn't have happened." Leah met his eyes. "We appreciate that." He gave a small nod and moved on, but his sincerity lingered like a balm. Not everyone on this flight was blind. When Diana returned to the cabin to oversee service, she carried herself with renewed rigidity, as though doubling down could erase doubt. She moved from row to row, her smile stretched tight, her voice louder than necessary. But when she reached Jordan and Leah again, her veneer cracked. She hesitated, her words catching. "Will you be dining with us this morning?" she asked. Her tone clipped, as though the simple act of offering a meal was somehow an intrusion. Leah tilted her head. "Is that a question or an invitation?" A flicker of red touched Diana's cheeks. She set down the tray with sharper force than needed, then moved on without another word. The moment was small, but it spoke volumes. Passengers noticed. The silver-haired man muttered something under his breath that sounded like disapproval. A young traveler in the back of the cabin shook his head. The ripples continued outward. Jordan leaned closer to Leah. "She doesn't realize she's writing the story herself. Every move she makes, people are watching." Leah's voice was quiet, but strong. "Then maybe it's time to let them see the ending they never expect." Jordan's eyes darkened with determination. "Not yet. Timing is everything." He sat back, waiting, as though sensing the moment would come when silence would no longer be the answer. Meanwhile, Diana returned to the galley, her mask slipping. She pressed her hands flat against the counter, breathing harder than she wanted. She thought of her years in uniform, the discipline, the order, the pride. She thought of all the times she had believed she was upholding standards. But now, for the first time, she wondered, what if the standards I've been upholding are the problem? The doubt was brief, but it unsettled her more than Jordan's words ever had. In row 2. Leah glanced around the cabin, reading the faces, curiosity, discomfort, sympathy, judgment. Every emotion was on display. She felt the heaviness of it all, but also the possibility. Stories had power. She knew, and right now, whether they wanted it or not, they were at the center of a story unfolding in real time. She closed her tablet and set it aside. 3 minutes, she whispered, almost to herself. Jordan looked at her, puzzled. 3 minutes. That's all it takes, she said softly. 3 minutes for the truth to change everything. Her words hung between them, quiet but prophetic, as the plane continued eastward through a sky that looked calm on the outside but carried storms within. Meal service had begun in earnest, carts rolling quietly down the aisle, trays lifted with precision, glasses clinking softly. The first-class cabin, usually a sanctuary of calm, carried an undertone of tension that no wine list could erase. Passengers leaned just slightly into the moment, pretending to browse menus or adjust headphones while their ears tuned toward row 2. The Miles couple had become the quiet center of gravity, and everyone seemed to sense that something more was coming. Jordan sat upright, shoulders square, the laminated menu open in his hands. His eyes scanned the choices: grilled salmon, filet mignon, roasted vegetables, but he wasn't really reading. He was waiting to see how far Diana Collins was willing to push. Leah, calm on the surface, traced the rim of her glass with a fingertip. She had chosen sparkling water, but it fizzed flatly now, bubbles dying like the patience in her chest. She glanced at her husband, recognizing the same resolve she'd seen on the nights when deals nearly collapsed. when boards questioned his leadership, when he stood his ground with nothing but calm certainty. Diana approached their row with deliberate steps. She placed her hands on the edge of the service cart as if bracing herself, her voice bright enough for nearby passengers to hear. Mr. and Mrs. Miles. I see you've had some difficulty with your seating earlier. I do hope the rest of your flight will be more comfortable. For dinner service, however, I'll need to confirm your selections verbally. It's important that we maintain standards of accuracy. Leah raised an eyebrow. Standards of accuracy. Does that requirement apply only to us? Diana's lips pressed into a thin smile. Of course not. But I find it helps to clarify with certain passengers who may be unfamiliar with our offerings. The silver-haired man across the aisle shifted in his seat, his frown deepening. His voice was low, but clear. That's enough. Diana stiffened. Excuse me. You heard me, he said, his tone heavy with authority. I've been flying Aurora Air longer than you've probably been in uniform. I know the service here. I've never seen anyone singled out like this. It's shameful. A murmur rippled through the cabin. A woman in the third row nodded slightly, and a man in the back coughed loudly, as if to punctuate agreement. Jordan set the menu down, folding his hands calmly on the tray table. His voice was steady, but his words cut with precision. Mrs. Collins, we've been more than patient. You've questioned our seats. You've questioned our presence. And now you're questioning our ability to order dinner. This isn't about standards. This is about assumptions. Leah's gaze was unwavering, her voice soft but sharp. And assumptions tell their own story, don't they? Diana's composure faltered. She could feel the eyes of the cabin burning into her back, stripping away the shield of professionalism she had always relied on. She opened her mouth, searching for a defense, but nothing came. Instead, she muttered something about double-checking orders and retreated to the galley, her footsteps quicker than usual. In the quiet that followed, Jordan leaned slightly toward Leah. It's almost time. Leah gave a small nod. Not yet. Let her write one more line of the story herself. In the galley. Diana slammed the clipboard onto the counter. Emily flinched at the sound. Why are you doing this? Emily asked, her voice hushed but fierce. Doing what Diana snapped? You know what? This isn't about tickets or meals. This is about them. Diana turned, her face flushed. You think I'm biased? I think you're showing the whole cabin that you are, Emily said softly. And the thing is, they're not saying anything wrong. They're holding themselves with more dignity than we are. Mark, polishing glasses nearby, added quietly. She's right. Diana, you're crossing a line. The words hit harder than Diana expected. She had always seen herself as professional, disciplined, fair. But now, standing in the galley with her colleagues' eyes on her, she felt exposed. She turned back to the reflection in the cabinet door. The uniform was perfect, the hair sleek, the posture immaculate. But her eyes told a different story. They looked uncertain, defensive, almost desperate. Meanwhile, in row 2, Leah closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engine steady her thoughts. She thought of Maya, their daughter, who had texted that morning before school. Good luck on your trip. Mom, be brave, be kind. Leah held on to those words now. Be brave, be kind. She wondered what Maya would think if she saw them here, sitting calm while their dignity was chipped at piece by piece. She hoped she would see not just endurance, but strength. Jordan's thoughts drifted too, though his eyes stayed forward. He remembered his father, who had worked decades at a factory in Georgia, passed over for promotions time and again. His father had taught him not to bow his head, not to let anyone else write his worth. Sitting here now, Jordan felt that lesson like armor. The cabin grew restless again when Diana returned. Her smile was forced, her voice tight. "Very well," she said, placing meals before them with sharper movements than necessary. Filet mignon for Mr. Miles, roasted vegetables for Mrs. Miles. Leah looked down at her tray, then back up at Diana. "Interesting," she said calmly. "I didn't order vegetables." A hush spread instantly. Passengers leaned closer. Diana froze. "I must have misheard." Jordan's voice was cool, steady as stone. "No, you didn't mishear. You made a choice." The words landed like a gavel strike. Diana's face flushed deep crimson. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, fumbling for anything that could soften the blow. But nothing came. She turned abruptly, pushing the cart away, her movements jerky, her pride collapsing under the weight of the cabin's gaze. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the silver-haired man across the aisle set his napkin on the tray table with finality. "This is disgraceful, and I intend to report it." A ripple of agreement followed. Passengers nodded. Some even clapped lightly, though the sound was awkward in the tense space. Jordan and Leah exchanged a glance. Leah's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Jordan gave the faintest nod. The moment was approaching the moment when silence would end, when truth would no longer be hidden. But for now, they remained composed, eating quietly, letting the weight of what had just unfolded settle into the bones of the cabin. Every passenger would carry this story with them, whether they realized it or not. And Diana, though she tried to busy herself with tasks at the front of the plane, could feel the truth pressing closer. She had crossed a line she could not uncross. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as dinner service wound down, casting a softer glow across the rows of leather seats. The clinking of silverware slowed until the only steady sound was the engine's low hum and the occasional shuffle of a passenger adjusting their seat. But beneath that calm exterior, the atmosphere in first class was taut as a wire. Everyone knew the evening had shifted. Everyone was waiting for something. Leah set her fork down gently, folding her napkin with deliberate precision. Her movements were elegant, but her eyes betrayed a quiet fire. She leaned toward Jordan, her voice so low it could barely rise above the murmur of the cabin. "It's time." Jordan gave a small nod. He adjusted his jacket, took a slow breath, and let his gaze drift toward the galley where Diana hovered, her clipboard clasped like a shield. Her steps had lost their grace. Her shoulders were tight, every movement defensive. She had gone from commanding to cornered in the span of an hour, and the passengers had seen it all. Emily approached softly, her presence like a bomb in the tense air. She crouched slightly by Jordan and Leah's seats. "I want you to know," she whispered. "I see what's happening, and I'm sorry. Truly." Leah's face softened. "Thank you. Emily, sometimes one voice of honesty is all it takes." Emily stood, her eyes shining with a quiet courage, then walked away to tend to another passenger. The silver-haired man across the aisle leaned forward, his voice steady. "If you decide to speak, you'll have an audience. People here want to hear the truth." Jordan met his gaze, and for a moment the two men strangers until this morning shared an unspoken understanding. Jordan turned back to Leah, placed his hand over hers, and rose from his seat. The motion caught the attention of nearly every passenger. Heads turned, conversations hushed, screens were paused mid-movie. Jordan stood tall, his frame commanding but not imposing, his presence filling the space with a calm authority that no uniform could replicate. He took a step into the aisle. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried with the weight of certainty. "There's something that needs to be said." Diana froze near the galley, clipboard halfway raised as if to remind everyone she still held authority. But her voice faltered. "Sir, perhaps this isn't the right time." Jordan's gaze met hers, unwavering. "On the contrary, Mrs. Collins, I think this is exactly the right time." The cabin fell utterly silent. Leah rose beside him, her posture graceful but resolute. Together, they stood not as weary travelers, but as something more. Jordan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek, embossed black card. The Aurora Air insignia glimmered faintly under the cabin lights, and a collective intake of breath spread through the rows. He held it steady, his voice calm. "My name is Jordan Miles. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Aurora Air. And this," he gestured to Leah beside him, "is my wife, Leah Miles, our Chief Financial Officer." Gasps broke through the silence. The murmurs began almost instantly, sharp whispers, incredulous tones, a cascade of disbelief rippling through the rows. Leah's voice followed, measured but resolute. "We did not announce ourselves when we boarded. We chose to experience this flight as passengers, not as executives. We wanted to understand what our customers face, not what our titles can shield us from." A woman in row 3 raised her hand slightly, as though pulled by instinct. "And what you faced was this," she said softly, nodding toward Diana. Diana's face had drained of color. She stood frozen, her clipboard trembling in her grip. "I didn't know." Jordan's tone sharpened just slightly, though it remained calm. "That's exactly the point. You didn't need to know who we were to offer basic respect." The weight of those words hung heavy in the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others lowering their eyes, confronted with their own silence during the earlier exchanges. Leah continued, her voice laced with quiet conviction. "This isn't about our titles. It isn't about power. It's about something far simpler and far greater. It's about dignity, about fairness, about the simple truth that every person deserves to belong in the seat they've earned, without suspicion or prejudice." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling with momentum. The silver-haired man clapped firmly, his face etched with satisfaction. A younger woman followed, her palms striking together with conviction. Soon, the cabin filled with the sound of hands meeting, a rhythm of solidarity that Diana could not drown out. Diana finally found her voice, though it cracked under pressure. "I was only doing my duty, protecting the standards of the cabin." Jordan cut her off, his words precise. "Standards are not upheld by suspicion. They are upheld by service, by integrity, by respect, and you failed that duty tonight." The captain appeared then, stepping out from the cockpit door. He had clearly been listening, his jaw tight, his expression grave. His voice carried through the cabin with crisp authority. "Mr. and Mrs. Miles, on behalf of this crew, I extend my deepest apologies. Mrs. Collins, you are relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight. Report to the galley at once." A stunned silence followed. Diana's eyes widened, her lips parting as though to argue. But the captain's gaze brooked no defiance. With shaky hands, she set the clipboard down on the service counter and turned, walking slowly toward the rear galley. The applause rose again, but this time it carried a different note, less of celebration, more of relief, of acknowledgement that a line had been drawn. Jordan inclined his head toward the captain. "Thank you. Not for us, but for the example you've just set," Leah added gently. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a conversation that must go far deeper than one flight, one crew, one mistake." The captain nodded solemnly, then returned to the cockpit. As Jordan and Leah sat back down, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The tension that had hung over the cabin dissolved, replaced with something quieter, heavier, more reflective. Some passengers avoided eye contact, clearly reckoning with their silence earlier. Others leaned forward, nodding in subtle gestures of respect toward the couple. Emily passed by softly, her expression a mix of pride and shame. She bent slightly and whispered, "Thank you for speaking the truth." Leah touched her hand briefly, "And thank you for standing on the right side of it." The hum of the engines filled the quiet, but the story had already taken root. Each passenger knew they would carry it with them into their conversations at home, their choices at work, their unspoken assumptions. What had happened in these few short hours would ripple far beyond the steel fuselage of Aurora Air Flight 228. The cabin exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for hours. Passengers shifted in their seats, some clapping softly still, others staring down at their trays, lost in thoughts they could not yet put into words. A flight that had begun as routine now felt like a chapter in something larger, something raw and undeniable. Jordan leaned back into his seat, shoulders easing for the first time since they had boarded. He took Leah's hand, squeezing gently. It was not triumph he felt, but gravity. They had revealed who they were, but what lingered now was the weight of what that truth meant for the crew, for the passengers, for the company they had built. Leah glanced around the cabin. The young woman 2 rows ahead kept turning toward them, her face pale, her eyes wide with something like shame. Finally, she gathered the courage to speak. "I just want to say," she began, her voice trembling, "I saw what was happening earlier. I should have said something, but I didn't, and now I realize my silence was part of the problem." Leah met her gaze, not with judgment, but with empathy, acknowledging that now is more powerful than you think. Change doesn't start with perfection. It starts with honesty. The silver-haired man leaned in from across the aisle. "I've flown Aurora Air for years. I've seen little things, subtle slights. Passengers who were treated as though they didn't quite belong. I always told myself it wasn't my business. But watching you both tonight," he paused, his voice thickening, "it makes me realize silence is its own kind of betrayal." Jordan nodded, his eyes steady. "It's never too late to do better. What matters is what you do next." Further back, an older woman who had remained quiet all evening raised her voice. "I grew up in the South," she said plainly. "I remember when people like you weren't even allowed in certain spaces. To see what just happened here, it broke something in me, but it also gave me hope." Her words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Several passengers nodded, some pressing napkins discreetly to damp eyes. At the front of the cabin, Emily lingered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. When she finally stepped forward, her voice carried an almost trembling strength. "I want to apologize, too. I didn't stop what was happening soon enough. I thought maybe it wasn't my place to challenge another crew member. But watching you stand your ground has shown me it's always my place when respect is on the line." Leah's face softened. "It takes courage to admit that, and even more to act differently next time." From the galley, Diana sat stiffly on the fold-down jump seat, staring at her shoes, Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and she couldn't shake the sound of applause echoing in her head. It wasn't just humiliation. It was something deeper. A mirror had been held up, and she was terrified by the reflection staring back. For years, she had prided herself on control, on precision, on embodying the standards of first-class service. Yet in a few short hours, she had become the example of everything she claimed to oppose. Mark approached quietly, leaning against the galley counter. "Diana," he said gently, "I've worked with you a long time. You're better than this. But tonight you let your worst instincts win." She looked up at him, her eyes wet. "I didn't mean intent doesn't matter," he interrupted softly. "Impact does." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to justify, but the words curdled before reaching her lips. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, the weight of her actions pressing hard against her chest. Back in the cabin, Jordan and Leah settled quietly into their seats again, but the energy around them refused to calm. A man in his 40s, dressed in a tailored business suit, leaned forward from behind. "If I may," he said carefully, "I think what you did tonight will go far beyond this plane. People like me, we read about things like this in the news and shake our heads, but we never imagine ourselves in the moment. You've forced all of us to see ourselves differently. That matters." Leah smiled faintly. "That's why we didn't announce who we were at the start. Titles shouldn't be required to command respect." Jordan's voice was steady, reflective. Respect should be the baseline. What you give to a stranger before you know their name, not after. Passengers murmured agreement, their voices weaving into the fabric of the flight. The hum of conversation shifted from casual pleasantries to something more searching, more honest. Stories began to spill, small stories of slights, of assumptions, of the subtle weight people carried every day. One woman spoke of being overlooked in boardrooms, another of being followed in stores. A man admitted to once questioning a fellow passenger's presence in business class, realizing too late how much his suspicion had revealed about himself. Leah listened closely, nodding gently, her heart heavy yet hopeful. This was what she had wanted, not shame, not spectacle, but reflection, seeds planted in quiet moments that might bloom into change. As the flight pushed eastward, the captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are cruising smoothly at 36,000 feet. I'd like to remind everyone that Aurora Air is committed to safety, service, and respect. Tonight's events remind us of the importance of living up to those commitments. On behalf of the company, thank you for your patience." The words were brief, measured, but they struck a chord. Passengers looked around, meeting eyes, exchanging small nods. The acknowledgement from the cockpit carried weight. It made the incident official, undeniable. Jordan closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. He could feel the cabin settling into a new rhythm, one born not of comfort but of confrontation. And confrontation, he knew, was often the first step toward progress. Leah leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "Do you think it will last?" she asked softly. He considered her words, his gaze drifting over the rows of passengers, their faces marked by thought. Maybe not for everyone, but for some, yes, and sometimes, some is enough to start. They sat in silence then, hand in hand, as the cabin lights dimmed further for the night stretch of the journey. But silence no longer meant complicity. It meant reflection, and for some, resolve. In the back galley, Diana remained hunched on the jump seat, replaying every word, every look, every clap of those passengers' hands. The captain's firm voice echoed in her mind. "You are relieved of duty." For the first time in her career, she questioned not just her behavior, but the belief she had carried quietly, unexamined. And though shame burned hot, a tiny seed of something else stirred beneath it, the possibility of change. The hours after the revelation moved differently, stretched thin by quiet conversations and heavy thoughts. Flight 228 had settled into the long cruise, the lights lowered, windows drawn. Yet the passengers in first class were far from sleep. What had begun as a confrontation between one crew member and two travelers had transformed into something else, a collective reckoning. Jordan sat upright, his laptop open but untouched. Numbers glowed on the screen, quarterly reports waiting for his review, but his eyes weren't on them. Instead, he watched the reflection in the darkened window rows of passengers behind him leaning close, whispering, processing. For years, he had led in boardrooms, in front of shareholders, on global stages. But tonight, leadership had found him here in the quiet truth of a cabin at cruising altitude. Leah shifted beside him, pulling the thin blanket around her shoulders. Her face was calm, but her mind moved quickly, tracing threads of what had happened. She thought about how stories worked, how a single flight could turn into a parable, how every passenger tonight would retell this moment in their own words. Some would soften it, some would exaggerate it, but none would forget it. That, she knew, was its power. From across the aisle, the silver-haired man leaned forward again, his eyes clear now with a kind of resolve. "Mr. Miles," he said softly, "I'll admit something. I sit on the advisory board of a regional bank. I've watched presentations on equity, on inclusion." I nodded. I clapped. But none of it hit me the way this did. I think when I go back, I need to do more than nod. Jordan closed the laptop, giving the man his full attention. "Change doesn't start in boardrooms," he said. "It starts in moments like these when someone realizes silence isn't neutral. It's a choice." The man nodded, his jaw tight. "Then I'll choose differently next time." 2 rows back. The young woman who had earlier confessed her silence leaned toward her seatmate, whispering rapidly. Snippets floated forward. "My company, recruiting, bias training." Leah caught the fragments and smiled faintly. Seeds, she thought. Seeds already taking root. At the front of the cabin, Emily moved through quietly, offering water refills and small words of comfort. Her service tonight was different, not mechanical, not rehearsed, but deeply human. She lingered longer with passengers, listening, nodding, sometimes simply placing a hand lightly on a shoulder. Where Diana's service had been edged with suspicion, Emily's radiated care. It was a contrast no one missed. In the galley, Diana remained on the jump seat, arms wrapped around herself. Every so often, she caught fragments of conversation drifting back, words like respect, assumptions, change, each one cut. She wanted to cover her ears, to shut it out, but she couldn't. It was her doing, and though the sting of humiliation was sharp, another feeling had begun to creep in, something less familiar, harder to name. Mark returned to check on her. "You need anything?" he asked gently. Diana shook her head. "No." Her voice was thin, brittle. She hesitated before adding, "Do you think they'll fire me?" Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I don't know. But maybe that's not the question you should be asking." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean, I mean?" he said carefully. "The real question is whether you'll let this end your story or begin a new one." She looked away, tears burning but refusing to fall. The question echoed, unwanted, but persistent. Back in row 2, Jordan finally closed his eyes. Leah watched him for a moment, then whispered, "You held back longer than I expected." He opened one eye, smiling faintly. "I wanted her to show who she was before we showed who we are. That way, no one can say it was about titles." Leah nodded. Smart, painful, but smart. She reached for his hand under the blanket, lacing her fingers through his. "Do you ever wonder if it's too much carrying it all at work, on flights, in hotels, in every space we walk into?" Jordan's eyes softened. "All the time. But then I remember, if we don't carry it, who will? And if we don't confront it, who will change it?" Leah leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. "I just hope one day Maya won't have to." The mention of their daughter drew silence between them, heavy but hopeful. Jordan pressed a kiss to Leah's temple. "That's why we keep going." The hum of the engines deepened as the flight edged across the Midwest sky. The captain's voice came once more, calm but pointed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be preparing for descent into Washington, D.C., in just under 2 hours. I'd like to remind everyone again that Aurora Air is committed to the highest standards, not just of safety and service, but of respect. Thank you for being part of tonight's journey." Passengers exchanged glances, some smiling faintly. It wasn't a typical captain's announcement, and that was the point. The company itself was acknowledging what had happened. That, too, was unforgettable. In the quiet that followed, conversations resumed, gentler now, but threaded with purpose. The older woman who had spoken earlier turned to her seatmate again. "When I get home, I'm calling my granddaughter. She needs to know this story. She needs to know the world is still hard, but that people are fighting to make it better." Her companion smiled. "That's the kind of story worth passing down." Jordan and Leah exchanged another glance. It was working. The pain of the evening had become something more a catalyst, a ripple moving outward. Meanwhile, Diana finally rose from the jump seat, her legs stiff, her throat dry. She stepped to the sink, splashing water on her face, staring at her reflection. For the first time, she admitted it not out loud, but to herself. "I was wrong." The words were bitter, but they carried a strange relief, too. She whispered into the empty galley, "What do I do now?" No one answered. But deep down, she knew the next steps weren't about excuses or saving face. They were about change. As the cabin prepared for descent, Jordan opened his laptop once more, this time typing a brief note to his executive assistant: "Schedule emergency meeting. Full leadership team. First thing tomorrow." Leah glanced at the screen and nodded. "It begins." The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon as Flight 228 began its slow descent toward Washington, D.C. The cabin stirred gently. Shades lifted to let in slivers of pink and gold. Passengers rubbed their eyes, adjusted their watches, murmured about connections and meetings. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of landing, something different lingered. Every person in first class knew they had witnessed more than a flight. They had been part of a moment that would follow them onto the ground. Jordan sat forward now, seatbelt buckled, laptop stowed. His mind had shifted into strategy mode. The leadership meeting he'd requested was already taking shape in his thoughts: what he would say, who needed to be present, what message they had to deliver, not just internally, but to the public. He understood the stakes. This incident, if unaddressed, could spread like wildfire. But if faced head-on, it could transform the company's culture in a way no policy manual ever had. Leah adjusted her scarf, her posture poised as if already preparing for the day ahead. She wasn't thinking about the press or the shareholders. She was thinking about the faces of the passengers, the woman who had admitted her silence, the man who had promised to choose differently, the grandmother who had vowed to tell her granddaughter. Those were the stories that mattered most. As the seatbelt sign chimed, Emily moved down the aisle, checking buckles, tucking in loose bags. When she reached row 2, she paused. "Mr. and Mrs. Miles," she said softly. "Thank you, not just for speaking up, but for how you did it. You showed strength without cruelty. I'll remember that." Leah smiled gently. "Remember it, Emily, and carry it forward. That's how change sticks." Emily nodded, her eyes shining, then moved on. At the front, Diana sat stiffly on the jump seat again, eyes fixed on the closed cockpit door. She hadn't spoken since the captain relieved her of duty. She hadn't dared. Yet inside, her mind raced. She thought of the faces that had turned toward her, the hands that had clapped against her silence. She thought of Jordan's words. "You didn't need to know who we were to offer basic respect." Oh, they replayed like a verdict. She felt both anger and shame, a churn she couldn't quiet. Mark leaned close as he strapped in beside her. "You'll have to answer for this when we land." Her throat tightened. "I know, but maybe," he added quietly, "you can decide how you answer. There's still a difference between excuses and accountability." Diana swallowed hard, saying nothing. The plane tilted, the ground rising into view. The Potomac River shimmered below, the monuments small but unmistakable in the early light. Passengers leaned toward windows, pointing quietly, yet the usual excitement of arrival was muted. Reflection still hung heavy in the air. As the wheels touched down, a ripple of applause passed through the cabin, not for the landing itself, but as though the passengers were acknowledging the close of a chapter they hadn't expected to read. Taxiing toward the gate, Jordan finally spoke again, his voice low but firm to Leah. "This can't just be about her. One crew member doesn't explain a culture. We need to ask harder questions." Leah nodded. "We will. But let's also remember change comes not from punishment alone, but from vision. If we only punish, we teach fear. If we lead, we teach possibility." Jordan smiled faintly. "That's why I married you. You always see the bigger picture." When the plane came to a stop, the seatbelt sign went dark, and passengers stood slowly. Some stretched. Some reached for bags. But many lingered, turning to Jordan and Leah with nods of gratitude, quiet words of thanks. The silver-haired man clasped Jordan's shoulder firmly as he passed. "Don't stop fighting," he said. "Neither should you," Jordan replied. The young woman paused too, her hand on her carry-on strap. "I'll start at my company," she promised. "I'll start there." Leah's eyes softened. "That's how change spreads, one place at a time." The older woman touched Leah's hand briefly. "Tell your daughter there are strangers out here cheering for her future." Leah's throat tightened, but she smiled warmly. "I will." As the passengers filed out, Emily remained at the front, greeting each one with a steadiness that belied the night's turbulence. When Jordan and Leah approached, she bent her head slightly. "Safe travels. And thank you. Again." Jordan inclined his head. "The thanks belongs to you, too. Emily, you reminded us there's still light in the system. Behind her." Diana remained seated, her eyes lowered. She couldn't bring herself to meet their gaze. When Jordan passed, he didn't stop, But he did pause just long enough to say quietly, "Reflection is painful, but it's also where growth begins." Then he moved on. Her chest tightened, tears threatening. She pressed her palms against her knees, trying to steady her breath. Once inside the terminal, Jordan and Leah walked with quiet purpose. Cameras hadn't found them yet, thankfully, but word would spread soon. By the time they reached headquarters, they knew the story would already be moving through whispers, emails, maybe even headlines. Jordan pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled quickly. Messages flooded in alerts from the PR team, texts from board members, an email flagged urgent from the head of human resources. Leah leaned over, reading the previews. "It's already started," she murmured. He nodded. "Then so do we." They moved through the bustling concourse, the noise of rolling suitcases and flight announcements blending into a dull roar. Yet for them, the world felt sharper, more defined. They weren't just walking through an airport. They were stepping into the next phase of responsibility. Outside, a car waited to take them to the Aurora Air headquarters in Denver. Jordan slid into the back seat, Leah beside him, their hands finding each other instinctively. Neither spoke for several minutes, the silence filled only by the rhythm of the road. Finally, Leah broke it. "Do you think she'll change?" Jordan didn't answer right away. He stared out the window at the passing city, the monuments gleaming in the morning sun. "I think she'll have to decide who she wants to be, and that decision will follow her the rest of her life." Leah nodded slowly. "Just like it will follow everyone who watched." Jordan turned back to her, his eyes resolute. "Then let's make sure it follows them towards something better." The drive from the airport to Aurora Air's Washington offices was brief, but it felt charged with the weight of what had transpired. Jordan sat with his phone in hand, scanning through the flood of messages. News had already broken online. A few passengers from Flight 298 had posted cryptic updates. "Never underestimate who's sitting next to you and witness something powerful tonight." Journalists were beginning to call. The story was moving faster than they had expected. Leah leaned against the seat, her posture composed, but her mind racing. She thought about the leadership team they were about to face. Some would defend the airline reflexively, afraid of scandal. Others would quietly cheer the stand she and Jordan had taken. But what mattered now was not sides. It was direction. When they arrived at headquarters, aides were already waiting. They ushered Jordan and Leah through glass doors into the executive wing. The building gleamed with sleek modern design, its walls lined with photographs of Aurora planes soaring above clouds. Yet this morning, even the polished halls couldn't mask the undercurrent of tension. Inside the boardroom, the senior leadership team had gathered heads of operations, communications, human resources, training, and legal. Their faces carried a mix of concern, defensiveness, and curiosity. At the center, an empty chair awaited Jordan. Another, beside it, awaited Leah. Jordan took his seat slowly, his presence commanding the room before he spoke a word. Leah settled beside him, her calm gaze sweeping the table. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her very silence demanded attention. The head of communications spoke first. "We've been monitoring social media. The story hasn't exploded yet, but it's building. We need to decide how to control the narrative before it spins out of our hands." Jordan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Control? This isn't about control. It's about truth. And truth can't be managed with spin." The room shifted uncomfortably. The head of operations cleared his throat. "With respect, Jordan, incidents happen on flights all the time. We discipline. We retrain, and we move on. That's the system. Leah leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp. The system isn't working if passengers are humiliated for the color of their skin. The system isn't working if respect depends on guessing someone's title. If that's what we call moving on, then we've already failed. The head of Human Resources spoke cautiously. So what do you propose? Jordan let the silence stretch just long enough to sharpen the question. Then he said, "We don't bury this. We confront it openly. We release a statement acknowledging what happened, not minimizing it. We commit to a full review of training, policies, and accountability measures." The legal officer frowned. "Jordan, that exposes us. Admissions of failure could lead to lawsuits." Jordan met his gaze evenly. "Pretending nothing happened will lead to far worse. I'm not interested in shielding us from lawsuits. I'm interested in shielding us from hypocrisy," Leah added, her tone firm but empathetic. "We can't ask our passengers to trust us with their lives if we don't even trust them with basic dignity. This isn't just about liability, it's about identity. Who are we as an airline? What do we stand for?" The boardroom quieted. Some lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others leaned back, thoughtful. Mark, the senior attendant from the flight, had been invited as a witness. He cleared his throat gently. "If I may, I've served on hundreds of flights. I've seen slights. I've seen assumptions. Most of the time, we brush them aside. But last night, it wasn't small. It was loud. It was public. And it was wrong. And the truth is, many of us knew better, but didn't act quickly enough. That has to change." All eyes turned to him. His words, spoken plainly, struck harder than any polished report could. Leah nodded. "Thank you, Mark. That's exactly why we're here. Not to punish one person, but to acknowledge a culture that allowed silence to feel safer than action." The head of training, a woman with sharp glasses and a thoughtful expression, spoke up. "Then let's design something real. Not the standard 3-hour seminar everyone forgets the next day. Let's create immersive training, real scenarios, real accountability. If Aurora Air is going to be known for anything, let it be this." Jordan's lips curved faintly, the beginnings of approval. "That's the direction we need. Not cover-ups, not half measures. Transformation." The conversation deepened, shifting from defensiveness to ideas, proposals for new oversight committees, passenger advocacy liaisons, anonymous reporting tools. The energy in the room began to change. What had started as a crisis meeting was turning into a vision session. But Jordan didn't let them forget the stakes. "Remember this, every passenger on that plane will carry their own version of this story. We can't control how they tell it, but we can decide what story we write from here. Either we are an airline that tolerates prejudice, or we are an airline that faces it head-on. Which one will we choose?" Silence followed, heavy but clarifying. Leah looked around the table, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "I thought of our daughter, Maya, on that flight. I thought about the world she's inheriting. If we don't fight for something better in the spaces we lead, what are we teaching her? That silence is safer, that respect is conditional? I refuse to pass that lesson down." Her words pierced deeper than any strategy plan. Even the legal officer, usually the most rigid in the room, shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the head of communications spoke again, slower this time. "Then our first step is a public statement, transparent, honest, and it has to come from you. Jordan, the passengers already know who you are. If we try to hide behind anonymity now, it will ring hollow." Jordan nodded, Then draft it. But make sure it isn't polished to death. I want it human. I want it real." The meeting stretched on, moving into logistics, timelines, next steps. But beneath the details, something profound had shifted. A reckoning had begun. As the executives filed out, Jordan lingered by the window, looking out at the city waking beneath the rising sun. Leah joined him, her hand finding his. "Do you think they'll follow through?" she asked. He squeezed her hand gently. "They will, because now they know it's not just about us. It's about every passenger who walks onto one of our planes." Leah leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, her voice quiet but steady. "Then maybe last night wasn't just a confrontation. Maybe it was a beginning." By mid-afternoon, the city buzzed with whispers. Reporters camped outside Aurora Air headquarters, their cameras trained on the glass doors as employees filtered in and out. Headlines were already circulating. Aurora executives confront discrimination on their own flight and airline faces. Reckoning after CEO's public clash with flight attendant. The air smelled of tension and opportunity. Jordan stood in his office, jacket draped across the back of his chair, sleeves rolled up. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from shareholders, messages from friends, requests from journalists. Yet he ignored most of them, focusing instead on the draft statement spread across his desk. Leah leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching him. "You've read that thing at least a dozen times. What's still bothering you?" Jordan rubbed his temple. "It's too polished. It sounds like any other corporate apology measured. Careful, forgettable. That's not what this moment needs." Leah crossed the room, picking up the draft and skimming the first lines. "Aurora Air regrets the unfortunate incident that occurred on Flight 228. She sighed. "Unfortunate? As if someone spilled coffee." She set the paper down. "No, we're not going to sanitize this. People need to hear truth in plain words." There was a knock on the door. Mark, the senior attendant, stepped in hesitantly. He held a folder, his uniform crisp, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. "Sorry to interrupt. I thought you should see this." He handed Jordan a stack of printed comments gathered from social media and passenger feedback already sent to customer service. Jordan flipped through them. Some praised how he and Leah handled the confrontation. Others expressed outrage at the attendant's behavior. A few revealed painful solidarity stories of passengers who had been overlooked, doubted, or mistreated in subtle ways for years. Leah read over his shoulder. "I've flown Aurora for 10 years. I've smiled through things I shouldn't have. But last night, watching someone finally push back, it gave me courage." She looked up, her eyes steady. "This isn't just our story anymore. It's theirs, too." Jordan closed the folder, his decision made. Then tonight, we speak, not from behind a press release, from a podium. Hours later, the atrium of Aurora Air's headquarters had been transformed into a stage. Rows of chairs lined the floor, filled with employees, media representatives, and community leaders. The company's logo loomed on a screen behind the podium. But tonight, it felt less like branding and more like a challenge. Leah stood at the edge of the stage, her breath slow and steady. She adjusted the microphone before Jordan approached, murmuring, "Remember, speak from the heart, not the handbook." Jordan nodded, stepping up to the podium as the room fell silent. The cameras clicked, the lights glared, but his focus was on the faces before him. Faces waiting, skeptical, hopeful. "Good evening," he began, his voice firm but warm. "Last night, on Flight 228, my wife Leah and I experienced something no passenger should ever face. We were doubted. We were questioned. We were made to feel that we did not belong in the seats we had rightfully purchased. A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd. Jordan let the words sink in before continuing. But here's the truth. Leah and I are not just passengers. We are the CEO and CFO of this airline. And that makes what happened even more troubling. Because if this is how we were treated, despite our titles, what happens when the passengers don't have those titles to shield them? How many times has someone been humiliated, dismissed, or made invisible without the power to stand and say, "This is wrong"? The room grew still. Some employees shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, captivated. Leah stepped beside him now, her voice carrying a calm intensity. This isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about a culture that has, for too long, allowed assumptions to dictate service. It's about silent moments when people chose not to speak up. And it's about every passenger who has walked away from a flight feeling smaller than when they boarded. Her words struck with quiet force. In the front row, Emily, the junior attendant, blinked back tears. Jordan continued, his tone measured but unwavering. So here is what we're going to do. Effective immediately, we are launching a full review of our policies, our training, and our accountability systems. Every member of our staff, from the cockpit to the call center, will undergo comprehensive equity and empathy training. We will create clear reporting channels for passengers and employees alike. And we will not hide these changes. We will share our progress publicly, because accountability only matters when it is visible. Applause broke out in the back rows, tentative at first, then spreading. Jordan raised a hand, not to silence them, but to redirect. This isn't about applause. This is about change. And change is uncomfortable. It asks us to confront the assumptions we carry, the blind spots we've ignored, the silences we've chosen. But if we want Aurora Air to mean something more than just a ticket from point A to point B, then we have to lead in more than just aviation. We have to lead in dignity. The room erupted again, louder this time. Even some of the executives who had resisted earlier now clapped, perhaps reluctantly, but clapped nonetheless. Leah's gaze swept the audience, lingering on Patricia Diana Collins, the lead attendant from the flight who sat near the back, invited to attend, but kept low in her chair. Diana's face was pale, her jaw tight, but her eyes were locked on the stage. Leah spoke directly, though without naming her. We all make mistakes. Some we regret instantly. Others we only understand when we see their impact through someone else's eyes. What matters now is not punishment for the sake of punishment. It's growth. It's choosing to listen when it would be easier to defend. It's learning to serve with empathy, not suspicion. Diana lowered her gaze, her hands clenched together, but she did not leave. Jordan concluded, his voice softening. I can't promise perfection, but I can promise pursuit. The pursuit of an airline where every person who boards feels valued, respected, and safe. That is the journey ahead of us, and we will walk it together. The applause that followed shook the atrium, rolling like thunder. Reporters shouted questions, employees embraced, and for a moment, the weight of the night before transformed into something lighter possibility. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Jordan and Leah stood in the quiet corner of the atrium. The lights dimmed, the chatter faded, but their shoulders remained squared, their resolve intact. "Do you think they believed us?" Leah asked softly. Jordan exhaled slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. Belief is a start, but what they'll remember is what we do next. The following morning, the nation woke to headlines carrying Jordan and Leah's words. Clips from the live stream of their speech had gone viral overnight. One clip in particular, Jordan asking, "If this is how we were treated, What Happens to Those Without Titles was replayed on morning shows, dissected on podcasts, and shared across social media with millions of views. Leah sat at the kitchen table of their Washington townhouse, sipping her coffee while scrolling through the news on her tablet. Maya, their daughter, wandered in, wearing pajamas, her hair a sleepy halo. She climbed onto Leah's lap, peering at the screen. "Mommy, why are you and Daddy on the news?" Maya asked, her small voice filled with curiosity. Leah kissed her daughter's forehead. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, telling the truth makes people pay attention. And Daddy and I had to tell the truth." Jordan entered the kitchen, still in his workout clothes, a towel draped around his shoulders. He paused when he saw them, watching Leah's arms wrapped around their daughter. It was the quiet anchor that gave him strength. "Good morning, my girls," he said, leaning down to kiss both. He picked up the newspaper from the counter front page. Aurora Air Faces Reckoning Leaders Promise Change. Later that day, Jordan and Leah returned to headquarters. The building felt different, lighter somehow. Employees greeted them with nods of respect, some even offering quiet thank yous. For the first time, Jordan sensed that change was no longer just demanded from the top, it was bubbling from within. In the training department, preparations for the new equity initiative were already underway. Lila, a seasoned consultant brought in overnight, greeted Jordan and Leah in a conference room. Her voice was warm yet firm. Transformation isn't about slogans. It's about repetition, accountability, and courage. Are you ready for the resistance? Leah didn't hesitate. We've lived resistance. Now we'll live through it with purpose. Meanwhile, Diana Collins sat alone in a small HR office. She hadn't slept much since the confrontation. Every word Jordan and Leah had spoken echoed in her mind, especially Leah's line. What matters now is not punishment, it's growth. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she had the strength to grow, but she knew she couldn't go back. Emily visited her, gently placing a coffee cup on the desk. "You look like you needed this." Diana gave a tired smile. "Thank you." "Emily, how did you keep so calm that night?" Emily hesitated. "I wasn't calm. I was scared. But I thought about my mom. She always told me, when you see wrong, speak right, even if your voice shakes. I guess I tried." Diana stared into the cup, her reflection trembling in the surface of the coffee. "I thought I was protecting the cabin. Instead, I was protecting my pride." She sighed, her voice quiet. "Maybe I still have something to learn." Emily touched her arm lightly. "We all do." While Diana wrestled with her own reckoning, the ripple of Jordan and Leah's speech spread far beyond Aurora Air. Civil rights leaders praised their candor. Aviation unions began discussions about how to integrate stronger inclusion training industry-wide. Other airlines, fearing backlash, announced their own reviews. By week's end, Jordan and Leah were invited to speak at a national aviation summit in New York. The ballroom buzzed with reporters, CEOs, pilots, and attendants from across the country. The backdrop read "Equity in the Skies, a New Era." Jordan stepped to the podium, his gaze steady. "This is not about one airline. This is about every airline, because the sky belongs to all of us, not just some of us." Leah followed, her tone calm but firm. "Change will be measured not by what we promise today, but by how a passenger feels when they step onto a plane tomorrow. Dignity is not optional. It is the ticket everyone has already paid for." The applause that filled the ballroom felt different, less like celebration, more like resolve. Weeks later, Aurora Air launched its Skyward Promise initiative. Immersive training programs, transparent accountability dashboards, scholarships for underrepresented youth in aviation. Employees wore new badges engraved with the words, "Every seat deserves respect." For Jordan and Leah, the work was just beginning. There were late nights, difficult boardroom debates, waves of public scrutiny. But there were also moments of hope, letters from passengers thanking them for giving voice to silent wounds. Employees who admitted they had never seen leadership so vulnerable, so human. One evening, after another long day, Leah sat with Jordan on their balcony overlooking the city lights. The night air was cool, the hum of traffic steady. She leaned into him, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think this will really last? Or will people forget once the headlines fade?" Jordan wrapped an arm around her. People forget headlines, but they don't forget how they felt. If even one passenger feels safer, one employee feels braver, then it's worth it. And if we keep walking, step by step, others will follow. Leah smiled faintly, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then let's keep walking." In the months that followed, Diana began attending the new training sessions. At first, she sat stiff, defensive, but slowly, she started speaking about her own biases, about moments when she had failed to listen, about the shame of realizing too late the harm she had caused. 1 year later, she volunteered as a peer mentor in the program, telling her story with humility. Emily, meanwhile, rose in responsibility. Her courage during that fateful flight had not gone unnoticed. She was promoted to a supervisory role, shaping the very culture she had once struggled to navigate. And for passengers, stories began to shift. A young woman tweeted, "First time flying Aurora in years. Attendants treated me with kindness I never expected. Maybe things really are changing." Another posted, "Was nervous boarding as a black traveler. Walked away smiling. Thank you, Aurora." The ripple had become a wave. At the end of that year, Aurora Air was recognized on a global stage for its leadership in equity and inclusion. Jordan and Leah stood together under bright lights, their hands clasped, as the award was presented. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Jordan's acceptance was brief. "This isn't the end of a journey. It's the beginning. The skies are wide enough for everyone, and we intend to prove it." As the applause thundered, Leah glanced toward the crowd, spotting Emily smiling proudly, Diana standing quietly but resolutely, and employees from every corner of the airline standing shoulder to shoulder. For the first time, it didn't feel like they were carrying the weight alone. The journey had begun with humiliation, but it had led to hope. And in that hope, there was healing not just for Jordan and Leah, but for countless others who had finally seen their truth spoken aloud. The story of Jordan and Leah Miles isn't only about one flight. It's about the silent battles many people face daily. Too often, dignity is questioned not because of actions, but because of appearances. The lesson is simple, yet profound respect is not optional. Every human being deserves to be seen beyond assumptions. For older audiences who have lived through decades of change, this story resonates as a reminder that progress is never automatic. Each generation must choose whether to uphold justice or let prejudice continue unchecked. Jordan and Leah's calm yet firm response shows that dignity can be defended without anger, and change can begin with one moment of truth spoken aloud. The message for all of us is clear in our families, workplaces, and communities. We are faced with the same choice: stay silent or speak. Sometimes courage looks like a quiet but steady voice saying, "I belong." We all belong. And in that courage, we not only defend ourselves, but we light a path for others to follow. Thank you so much for watching and for walking with us through this powerful journey. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of justice, hope, and humanity to light. Together, we can keep these conversations alive.